There are moments when you realize you're no longer trying to figure everything out the way you used to. Not because you suddenly understand it all, and not because you've stopped caring. It's just that there's a kind of quiet inside you now, wide enough that you don't feel the need to name every emotion that passes through. For Taurus, this doesn't come easily. You're used to keeping things within reach, within control, your feelings, your choices, even the way you let someone get close. But lately you might be sensing it too. Something is shifting. Not loudly, not clearly. Just the way you've been holding yourself together doesn't feel as fixed as it once did. It's like an ordinary afternoon. Light still falls through the window at that familiar angle. The distant hum of traffic moves along just like any other day. And yet, something small makes you pause a little longer. Maybe it's the way you read a message and don't feel the need to reply right away. Or the way you no longer feel that urge to explain your emotions just to make them make sense. You sit there with a cup of tea that's gone a little cold, and you notice you're not rushing anymore. Not because you've become indifferent, but because something in you is learning how to stay with what doesn't yet have an answer. And if you really look at it, that's not something Taurus usually leans into. You tend to prefer clarity, to know where you stand, to understand where things are going. But maybe clarity doesn't always come from thinking harder. Sometimes, it comes from not trying to understand so much. You might remember how it used to be. When something felt uncertain, you'd move quickly to define it. Is this something I want? Should I keep going or step back? Is this safe or is there risk here? You've been used to organizing your inner world like arranging a room, everything in its place, everything accounted for. And if something didn't quite fit yet, you wouldn't feel settled. But now it feels like you're letting a few things stay in the middle of the room a little longer. Not putting them away right away, not deciding too quickly. Just letting them be there. And watching. Maybe it started with small shifts. A conversation that didn't need a clear conclusion. A feeling that didn't need to be labeled as right or wrong. Or simply you no longer feel the need to understand someone else as quickly as before. You're giving them and yourself a little more space. Not because your standards have disappeared, but because you're trying something different. Something softer, slower, less controlled. At times, it might feel a little unfamiliar. Part of you still leans toward the old rhythm, wanting certainty, clarity, reassurance that you're doing things the right way. But there's another part now, quieter, that gently suggests maybe not everything needs to be understood right away. It's like standing by the ocean early in the morning. You don't need to know where each wave is going. You just stand there listening to the water, feeling the wind against your skin, and somehow that's enough. And maybe, in moments like that, you begin to notice something subtle, that not having all the answers doesn't make you weaker. If anything, it opens up a different kind of steadiness, one that doesn't come from control, but from your ability to stay present with what isn't fully clear yet. For Taurus, this isn't a loud or dramatic change. It's more like the way soil softens after a quiet rain. No one sees it happen right away, but if you touch it, you can feel the difference. You might not have a name for what's unfolding, and truthfully, you don't need one right now. There are phases in life that aren't meant to be understood, they're meant to be felt. And maybe this is one of those moments. A moment where you're no longer trying to figure everything out, and somehow, you're beginning to feel more deeply than ever before. And from that deeper place, you begin to notice something a little unexpected. That the strength you've carried with so much pride sometimes feels like a coat you've worn for too long. It fits, it's familiar, it's protected you through heavy winds. But then the weather shifts. And somehow, you're still wearing it, not because you need it, but because you're used to it. No one is asking you to take it off. It's just that your body starts to feel the weight. A kind of heaviness that's hard to name. Not because something is wrong, but because something no longer fits the way it once did. You've always been good at taking care of everything on your own. The small things, the big things. You've had your way of handling it all. You didn't need reminders. You didn't need someone standing there telling you that you were doing well. And honestly, you have been doing well. There were times when that steadiness was the very thing that kept you standing. But then there comes a quiet moment so subtle you could almost miss it, when that same strength begins to soften. It doesn't disappear. It just doesn't want to move the way it used to. You might notice it in small details. One day, you don't feel the need to solve everything right away. You let a few things sit a little longer than usual. Not because you've become careless, but because you're listening to a different rhythm inside you. A slower one, a lighter one that doesn't push you to prove anything. There was a time when doing everything on your own gave you a sense of control. But now sometimes it leaves behind a quiet emptiness. Not the kind that feels like lack. More like you've finished a full busy day. Everything went fine, nothing went wrong. But when you finally sit down, you notice there's no one there to share it with. No one who needs to know how hard you tried. And in that still moment, a soft question appears. Not to challenge you, not to make you uncomfortable. Just to gently turn your attention inward. Have I been doing everything alone, not only because I can, but because I've grown used to not letting anyone step in? Strength, in the right moment, can be a foundation. But when it stretches on for too long, it can quietly turn into a habit one you no longer think to question. It's like carrying a bag that's always been full. At first, it held what you truly needed. Then, over time, you added things just in case, things for later, things to be sure. And before you knew it, the bag became heavy, but you kept carrying it anyway, because the weight felt familiar on your shoulder. Maybe this month, you've started to feel that weight a little more clearly. Not all at once. Not in a way that overwhelms you, but as a quiet slowing down, like walking along a road you've known for years. And suddenly, you don't feel like rushing anymore. You slow your steps. You look around. And in that moment, you realize you've been walking alone for quite some time. What stands out is you don't feel the need to prove that you're okay. Before, you might have adjusted, quickly reminding yourself to stay strong, to keep going, to not let your emotions slow you down. But now you let that feeling stay a little longer. Not to sink into it, but to listen, to hear what it might be trying to say. And maybe what it's saying, you're not strong enough. Maybe it's something quieter. You don't have to be strong in the same way all the time. There's another kind of strength. Not loud. Not defined by carrying everything alone. Something lighter. More flexible. Like setting the bag down for a few minutes, not because you can't carry it, but because you realize you don't have to carry it all the time. That moment doesn't make you weaker. If anything, it lets you feel your body more clearly. Your breath more fully. The space around you that you once moved through too quickly to notice. You don't need to change everything right away. You don't need to decide that from now on you'll be completely different. Just noticing that there's a part of you curious about another way of being less forceful, less controlled, and maybe a little more open, even if it only shows up in small ways no one else can see. Maybe it's the way you take a little longer to reply to a message, but when you do, it feels more honest. Or the way you admit, even just to yourself, that there are days you don't want to do everything alone anymore, not because you can't, but because you don't need to prove anything. And if you stay with that feeling long enough, you might begin to notice that this quiet fatigue isn't a sign that you're becoming weaker. It's more like a gentle signal that the way you once protected yourself might be ready to be set down little by little. And when something that has stayed with you for so long begins to be set down even just a little, you start to notice a different kind of space appearing. Not the kind of emptiness that makes you uneasy, but more like stepping into a familiar room, and somehow, there's more light this time. Corners that used to stay in the dark begin to reveal themselves. You see more clearly the things you've been walking past without noticing. And somewhere in that space you begin to feel something quietly returning. Not something you've lost, but something you're starting to see again. On the surface, you still seem the same. Nothing outside has changed much. You move through your days as usual. You keep your rhythm steady. You respond in ways that feel grounded, reliable the way people expect from you. But there are small shifts happening where no one else can see. Maybe it's the way you don't react as quickly when someone moves a little closer. Maybe it's the way you stay quiet a bit longer in a conversation, not because you have nothing to say, but because you're listening to something deeper within yourself. The walls you once built, they weren't wrong. They had their reasons. There were times in your life when keeping distance was the only way to stay balanced. You learned not to say everything, not because you didn't trust people, but because you needed to hold on to a sense of safety for yourself. You learned to manage what others could reach as a way of protecting your inner world from being shaken too quickly. And all of that helped you stay steady through so many phases. But here's the quiet part. When you stay steady in the same way for too long, you might not notice that you've also been standing still. Not because you didn't want to move forward, but because those walls became so solid that nothing could easily pass through, even the gentle things that meant you no harm. You might remember a small moment when someone said something sincere to you, and instead of letting it stay a little longer, you instinctively began to analyze it, question it, or softly shift the conversation away. Not because you didn't appreciate it, but because you were used to keeping things from going too deep. You kept it at a distance, a place where you could still manage how you felt. But slowly, you begin to see these walls don't cause obvious pain. They don't take something away all at once. They just keep things from getting closer. It's like standing behind a sheet of clear glass. You can see everything. You understand what's happening, but you don't truly touch it. And maybe recently you've started to feel that glass. Not because it's thicker, but because you're becoming curious about what it might feel like on the other side. A very gentle curiosity, like placing your hand against the surface not to break it, but just to notice whether it's still as necessary as it once felt. This doesn't happen loudly. There's no moment where you decide, from now on, I'll open up. It comes slowly, almost quietly, naturally. You might let a conversation go a little further than before. You might allow a feeling to stay longer, instead of brushing it aside. You might let someone see a smaller part of you, but one that feels more real. And what stands out is this: you don't feel as threatened as you once did. Not because the world outside has changed, but because inside you, a different kind of steadiness is beginning to take shape. Not the kind that comes from controlling everything, but the kind that comes from knowing that even when something touches you more deeply, you can stay with it without losing yourself. There are quiet evenings now when everything slows down, and you sit with yourself, not to analyze, not to fix anything, just to feel. And in those moments, you begin to see more clearly that the walls you once needed don't have to stay exactly the same anymore. Not because they were wrong, but because you've moved beyond the part of your life that needed them. You don't have to tear everything down all at once. No one really does. What lasts usually changes slowly. A brick loosens. A small opening appears. A narrow space just wide enough for light to come through. And that is already enough for something new to begin. And maybe what you're going through isn't about losing your protection. It might be about learning how to experience the world without so many layers in between. And as the space between you and the world begins to soften even just slightly, you may start to notice a different kind of feeling emerging. Not something loud, not something easy to define, but enough to catch your attention. It doesn't feel like what you once called strength. It doesn't ask you to hold everything together. It doesn't ask you to prove anything. It's simply a state where you allow yourself to stay a little longer with things you used to move past too quickly. For a long time, there's been this quiet assumption that opening up means losing control. That if you let your feelings go deeper, You might lose that steady ground you've always relied on. But lately, in your own way, you might be seeing it differently. Not because someone told you, not because you read it somewhere, but because your own experience in very ordinary days is beginning to show you something new. Maybe it's an evening you're sitting in a familiar cafe, a glass in front of you, barely touched. A conversation nearby moves more slowly than usual. You're not part of it, but you're listening. Not to analyze, not to interpret, just listening. And somewhere in that quiet presence, you begin to notice not every feeling needs to be processed right away. Some moments, if you don't rush to close them off, seem to soften on their own. Right now, opening up doesn't feel like tearing down everything you've built. It's not a big decision. It's not a dramatic shift. It's more like cracking a window open just a little. Not all the way. Just enough for the air outside to drift in, and for you to sense something different from the space you've always known. You're still you. You still hold your values. But the way you stay with your emotions is beginning to change. Before, when something touched you, your mind would move quickly. Is this safe? Should I continue? Am I going too far? Now there are moments when you don't ask right away. You let the feeling stay a little longer. Not because you've become careless, but because you're experimenting with a different kind of stability. One that doesn't come from control, but from knowing you can stay with whatever you feel without needing to rush to change it. And it often begins in very small ways. You read a message more slowly, not searching for the right reply, but listening for what feels honest. You hold a gaze a little longer, not trying to find meaning, but simply being present. Or maybe you don't feel the need to pull back immediately when something starts to deepen. And there's something interesting here. When you don't close off right away, you begin to notice layers of emotion you hadn't seen before. Not all of them are easy. Some bring a quiet hesitation, a slight heaviness. But alongside that, there are also moments that feel warm, real, the kind you might have missed before, simply because you were used to keeping distance. For Taurus, this isn't a loud transformation. It doesn't arrive as a bold decision. There's no moment where you say, "From now on, I'll be different." It unfolds slowly, so quietly, almost no one else would notice. And maybe because of that, it carries a different kind of strength. You don't need to prove that you've opened up. You don't need to explain it to anyone. It's enough to notice that in very ordinary moments, you no longer close off as quickly as before. And sometimes just that alone is enough for something new to begin taking shape. There will still be days when you return to old patterns. Days when you prefer distance. Days when you want certainty before taking another step. And that's okay. But in between those days, there are small moments when you choose to stay a little longer. Not because you force yourself to, but because you're genuinely curious where that feeling might lead. And within those quiet moments, you may begin to sense something you never quite named before. That opening up doesn't take away your steadiness. It simply changes how you hold it. No longer gripping tightly, but holding it with more ease, more flexibility. Like a handful of sand, if you clench too tightly, it slips away faster. But if you hold it gently, it stays longer, more naturally. And maybe, in your own way, you're learning to hold things like that. Not through the kind of strength you've always known, but through something softer, quieter, less visible, but deeply real. And perhaps it's from that softness that something inside you begins to shift, not to turn you into someone else, but to allow you to stay with yourself in a deeper way, a calmer way, and with less need to stay guarded than before. When you're no longer holding yourself in that constant state of readiness, always bracing, always anticipating something else begins to take shape. Not a complete letting go, not a loss of awareness, but something lighter, like stepping out of a closed room and realizing the air outside isn't as harsh as you once thought. You don't feel the need to check everything before taking another step. You don't feel the need to measure every reaction, every possibility, every outcome that could unfold. There's a quiet space now where you don't have to prepare every answer in advance. There was a time when you believed everything had to unfold a certain way for you to feel safe. The timing had to be right. The rhythm had to align. The steps had to make sense. There had to be logic, clarity. You needed to know where you were going before you truly moved forward. And that way of living protected you. It helped you avoid so many risks. But over time, it also asked you to hold too much within your control. Not just your actions, but your emotions, and even the parts of yourself you allowed to be felt. And then there are days when you no longer want to keep everything so carefully arranged. Not because you've stopped caring, but because you begin to notice trying to keep everything right sometimes pulls you away from what feels true. It's like driving on a road you've known for years. If you only follow the map, you miss the small changes outside your window. But when you look up, you start to see the road isn't exactly the same as the last time you passed through. There are connections that don't need to be controlled to exist. You don't have to know where they're going. You don't have to decide right away whether they're right or not. Sometimes just being there, in that moment, as you truly are, is enough. At first, this may feel unfamiliar. You're used to understanding, to certainty, to direction. But now there are things that don't need all of that to carry meaning. There are feelings that don't need to be named right away to be real. You can feel something without defining it. You can care without labeling it. You can move a little closer without deciding how far you'll go. And in that unhurried space, something opens. When you stop trying to arrange everything, a different kind of openness appears. At first, it might feel a little disorienting. You've been used to structure, to order, to plans. But this space isn't there to make you feel lost. It's more like an open field where you can step into it without needing to know exactly what you'll do there. It's not emptiness. It's a kind of openness where things are allowed to unfold on their own. You don't have to guide a conversation into a specific direction. You don't have to adjust your feelings to fit a script you've already written. You can just be there and notice what happens. And maybe you'll start to see, when you're no longer trying to control every turn, things begin to move in their own rhythm. Not faster, not slower, just different from what you once arranged. There are small moments, quiet ones, where a connection feels effortless. A glance that doesn't need explaining. A sentence that doesn't need to be perfect. A silence that no longer feels uncomfortable. This doesn't mean you've stopped caring about where things might lead. It simply means you don't need to know right away. You allow yourself to stay with the process instead of focusing only on the outcome. And within that process, you begin to see more clearly how you truly feel, what you genuinely want, and what brings you a quiet sense of ease. There are evenings now when everything has settled, and you sit with yourself and notice that the day has passed without you needing to control so much. Things still happened, not perfectly, not according to plan, but somehow nothing truly felt wrong. And that feeling, it's not loud, but it's real. You don't have to abandon the way you used to live. You don't have to change everything at once. You only need to recognize there might be another way to experience life. A way that doesn't rely so heavily on control, but on your ability to stay present with what is unfolding, even when it's unclear, unfinished, without answers. And maybe within that space, you begin to feel something deeply calm. Not because everything has fully settled, but because you no longer feel the need to force it into the kind of stability you once believed it had to be. And as that need to keep everything just right begins to soften, you start to notice a very different kind of presence. Not the kind of certainty that comes from knowing everything in advance, but a quietness that comes from no longer needing to hold on so tightly. It's like standing in an open space, not reaching for something to steady yourself. Not searching for something to grasp, just standing there, feeling the ground beneath your feet, your breath moving gently, and realizing that's enough. When you're no longer trying to hold everything together, something else begins to take shape. It doesn't arrive clearly. There's no obvious sign that tells you it's there. But if you stay with it long enough, you begin to notice. The way you can sit in stillness without needing to fill the silence. The way you can look at things without reacting right away. The way you can be with someone without feeling the need to become a better version of yourself. No need to perform. No need to attract. No need to prove anything. The things that once made you adjust, made you overthink, no longer take up as much space inside you. Not because you've stopped caring, but because you no longer need to place yourself in a position where you have to be seen a certain way. You're simply there as you are. And strangely enough, that quiet presence carries a different kind of pull. Not the kind that draws attention immediately. Not the kind that makes you the center of everything. But something softer, like when someone is near you and realizes they don't have to tense up, they don't have to perform, they don't have to prove anything either. They can just be there the way you are. You might not notice it right away, but there will be small moments when a conversation flows more easily. When silence no longer feels like something you have to fix. When a glance doesn't need explanation. And in those moments, something real is there. It doesn't need a name. It doesn't need to be defined. It just exists. Quietly. Naturally. Everything begins to move in its own rhythm. Not the rhythm you once tried to control, but something lighter, more organic. Like placing a leaf on the surface of water, you can't decide where it will go. But you can sit there and watch how it drifts. And sometimes by not interfering, you begin to see more clearly what's actually unfolding. And it's enough for someone to feel it if they happen to be moving at the same pace. Not everyone will notice. Not everyone will stay. And somehow that doesn't weigh on you the way it once did. Because you're no longer trying to create connection at any cost. You're simply allowing what aligns with your rhythm to appear naturally. Maybe this isn't an ending. Maybe it's not a clearly defined destination either. You don't need to know where it leads. You don't need to name what's forming. Because sometimes the deepest things don't need to be confirmed right away. They just need to be felt in the moment they exist. It's simply a moment when you realize you're no longer standing in the same place as before. Not because you've gone somewhere far, but because the way you stay with yourself has changed. You no longer have to pull back to feel safe. You no longer need to stretch yourself outward just to find connection. You just stand where you are. And in that simplicity, there's something steady but not rigid. Clear but not needing explanation. A kind of presence where you don't have to become someone else to be accepted. You don't have to do more to be seen. You don't have to prove that you're worthy of anything. You're just there, and in a very quiet way, that's enough. And sometimes simply not having to be anyone other than yourself in order to connect can feel like a very real shift.